for Queers, the corner of the internet where I talk to you about queer books. But today I'm not talking about books at all. Today I'm talking about art. So I don't think I've mentioned this before, but I'm a big art lover. This is a passion that came from my grandmother on my dad's side, and I just continued expanding it all throughout my life. I've been very fortunate in visiting so many beautiful art galleries in the countries where I lived or where I visited, and I absolutely make it a priority. And I always wondered which artists were more similar to me in terms of what they went through in their lives and their queerness. And I'm guessing a whole lot of you have experienced the same thing and asked yourselves the same questions, especially since a lot of professors in art school or during your classes in high school did not mention people's sexuality at all. And while in some cases it's all very good and nice, in other cases makes us feel or might make us feel quite on the sidelines of history and art. And so I'm here to present to you my favorite artist. And it's very interesting because it's not an artist that I discovered while in school. As I said, it's not it's not a person that will come up during classes, but it's somebody that I learned about on my first year away from home. So when I was in Glasgow in 2017, and Glasgow has a beautiful modern art gallery right in the city centre, and it's a great place to get lost at when you don't really have friends in a city yet. And the Glasgow Modern Art Museum has a library in the basement, which I think is great, and I thought it was the coolest. And I remember that I just stumbled upon this book about a man called Francis Bacon, not the philosopher, this is an artist, Francis Bacon, and I was immediately attracted by his pictures. And once you see them, if you don't know him, you're gonna be like, why? Like, why? These are very particular paintings, and they're totally different from the other kind of like artistic passion that I have, which are the Impressionists. Yeah, that's to nobody's surprise, right? And my favorite Impressionist artist is Renoir, and he's called like the Master of Light, and Francis Bacon is like the furthest thing that you could think of. Francis Bacon was queer, and this was an intrinsic part of his art, even though a lot of critics never actually mentioned it, and we're gonna get into that in a little bit. But yeah, so this video is about Francis Bacon. So today's video is going to be supported by my own notebook and by library books, because while I do know some things about Francis Bacon, I obviously wanted to let you know a little bit more about him and not just take for granted what I take for granted and what I already know about him. Because as I said, I've been a fan of his since 2017, and I've managed to visit his studio in Dublin, which I have the funniest story about that. But you know, his studio in Dublin, and then his works in Edinburgh, nearby in Denmark, in Paris, in London, in a lot of places. And so I know a fair amount about his work. But Francis Bacon was born in 1909 in Dublin. So he's an Irish painter, but by all means and purposes, the majority of critics out there refer to him as an English painter, because he painted mainly in London. His main studio was in London, and also from a very young age his entire family would just move back and forth from Dublin to London because of his father's job as a race horses handler of sorts. And one salient point of his life is definitely his relationship with his father. So his father was a very old-fashioned man. He was prone to anger, and he was a veteran of Boer War, which happened, you know, before the First World War. And so you kind of understand the picture of the man that he was, and he wasn't too happy with how Francis was being raised or in the sense of how he was growing up, He always had a penchant for femininity, and because of his chronic asthma, he also wasn't really a fan of being outdoor and taking up the same masculine hobbies that his father and his siblings had to take up for the time, that they were living in. And then once the First World War broke out, then they moved permanently to London for their father's job. And one thing to consider is that Bacon, because of his chronic asthma, which was really severe all throughout his life, was never actually called up to fight either in the First or Second World War years later. So I also want to paint the picture of, kind of the social and historical moments that we're discussing. So he was born in 1909. As I said, this is before the First World War breaks out and before the Second World War. He lives through a lot of changes, obviously, because he passes in 1992. He lives through a lot of changes. He lives through the, not birth of photography, but the kind of impact that it has on art, and on his art is really, really shown later on. And this wouldn't have been possible had he been born way before. So, and another thing that he obviously lives through is all these inexplicable changes and evil that goes on around him when it comes to wars and genocide, and a lot of things that obviously scarred a lot of people. And so this is kind of the context where Francis Bacon grows up. And this is really, really reflected in his art later on. He does not start off as a painter. He does not start drawing or painting from his early life. He had nothing to do with that until later. And I'm going to talk about it in a second. So when he moves with his family to London, he's then enrolled in an all-boys college, and it is there where he kind of realizes that he's not like other boys, he is gay. And this is an acknowledgement, an awareness that is going to shape his relationships with his family and his siblings and all throughout his life. If I'm not mistaken, this you can take with a grain of salt. One of the books that I read about Bacon was a friend's retelling of his relationship with Bacon. And this friend, Michael Peppiatt, also went on to write his biography, Bacon's biography. And if I'm not mistaken, it tells about Bacon's break with his dad especially. I think this was still in Dublin, so years before his teenage years, let's say, and his father walks in while he's trying on either his mom's clothes or his mom's makeup, as one does, and he just gets incredibly mad, and that was kind of a turning point for their relationship, which breaks down completely. And then in 1927, Bacon moves to Paris by himself, where he learns French at a musician's house where he's staying, and he goes exploring, the Louvre and all the nice artistic sites that you see in Paris. And it is there in 1927, in the summer of 1927, that he stumbles onto Picasso's exhibition. And it is there that he decides, I'm going to give this a try. I'm going to be a painter. And Francis Bacon was a very stubborn man. This was a recollection that literally every person that ever met him understood immediately. And once he put something in his mind, then it was that. Like, you could not change his mind. And so he tries. He starts to systematically paint, and he starts developing a more sustainable, let's say, way for him to paint and to actually make it. So once he goes back to London, he actually starts out as an interior designer, and he actually could have made a good career out of it. He was talented enough, but he decided not to. And so that was 1928, so the year after he moves to Paris. So he's in Paris for a year, he finds Picasso's exhibition, he decides to be a painter, and then goes back to London, starts working as an interior designer, and then starts painting and painting more. But one thing that is to know about Bacon is that he was a perfectionist. The worst kind of perfectionist, the type of perfectionist that destroyed his own works if he wasn't satisfied with them. So we don't actually have a lot of stuff from his first years in the 1930s. We don't actually have that much stuff coming out from him. You might be asking yourselves, what type of movement did he belong to, or what type of painter was he? So he was defined as an expressionist, but he loathed that term. It just made him so annoyed. And so a lot of other critics started using the term realist. And here we're not talking about the realism you might have learned at school, where we're talking about a realist writer or realist painter, where it's all very realistic portraits of nature, like in their, details and all of that, with the concern of representing the world as it is, without, rose-colored glasses like the Romantics did, or anything like that. But according to Schmied, which is the author of this lovely book that I picked up at the library, when we refer to Bacon as a realist or belonging to the realism movement in a way, we're talking about the way he really was keen on portraying people's lives within their own bodies, the fidelity of living inside the body. And I think that's really, really interesting. You really can see that in his paintings. I obviously don't have anything with me, but as I'm talking and while I edit, I will put up a whole lot of paintings that I think really showcase this idea. And so he was a lot of the times called an exaggeration artist, even though he didn't set out to be exaggerating anything, really. He wanted to paint the things that he felt the bodies and living inside the body meant to people and to himself. And so a lot of his themes are recurring throughout his life. He painted until he basically dropped dead, and that's what he wanted to do. He loved it so much. And so I just wanna look at my notes and saying that his paintings always give the discomforting sense of how a human being is actually created. And he paints the way that he understands the way that we are at the mercy of our own bodies. And he actually hated that about himself. He was not very at ease with his own body, as a lot of people aren't. And he just realized that every time, I think this is an actual quote of one of the books, that every time you looked at the mirror, death was doing its thing. And I think this is really important to tie first to his chronic asthma. He was basically disabled his entire life. I know that we don't necessarily consider asthma a disability, but I do think that it somewhat is, and especially his was really chronic and really bad all throughout his life. And so obviously he hated being tied to these mass of flesh that kind of worked against him, like didn't let him do the things that he wanted to do. Second, I think that personally we can tie it to the way his asthma and his body distanced him from his father, especially, like from ever getting the approval of his father. You can see how in his paintings he sort of mistreated and maltreated human flesh, but as critics pointed out, he seemed to love the color of flesh more than any other colors. And I think this is really fascinating. And he saw human nature for what it was. This is really to tie to his own environment, like the First World War and its atrocities, and then the Second World War, it's just after that he kind of becomes really, really big. And there's a lot of paintings that he does after the Second World War where he is just adamant in depicting the evilness and the banality of evil, and how, you know, cruel the world can be in its fate. And he sees death as just being inevitable. He just sees it as an all-consuming force in life, and it's just something that happens and people have to deal with, just as we have to deal with the fact that our bodies are not limitless and that other people's destiny is sometimes out of our own hands. Another recurring theme in Bacon's world is popes. And you're gonna be like, what? Pope? I think this was so interesting, and I think this is part of the reason why I was so attracted to his paintings, which are really violent, which I think it's part of the reasons why he's not actually talked about in school. Like, how do you show these type of paintings to high schoolers and get away with it? I think they're really crude and raw, and I think it needs an adult eye, an emotionally mature person to look at these paintings and see them for what they are, because they're so different than classical paintings and even other contemporary art. In my opinion, I don't think I've ever seen anything that's quite as violent as Bacon's paintings. For the colors he uses, for the themes and the main, you know, figures that he uses, they're just so violent. And going back to the idea of the popes, so he gets inspired by Velázquez's Pope, which he actually never sees in real life. It is a painting that belongs to, or it's in Rome, and Bacon for all his life purposely avoided the original painting. Despite making, I think we're talking 45 works all throughout his life, all variations of these popes. And then he stopped in 1965, and Schmied here refers to it as almost being freed from this obsession. He has a lot of obsessions, this man. He is obsessed with gambling, he's obsessed with alcohol. There's a lot of things that are haunting Francis Bacon. But the popes are one of his most recognizable traits. And one thing that is to note, and you're gonna notice it in these paintings, is the gaping mouth. There's two reasons for this, and he was obsessed with the idea of a gaping mouth. One was the movie Battleship Potemkin, is that how you say it? I think it is, by Eisenstein. And then he found a secondhand book in Paris of mouth diseases, and this changed everything. And so with these two pieces of inspiration, he just kept on using them like over and over again, because to him, a primal scream like the ones that he's depicting in the face of violence and in the face of evil are the thing that makes you realize that you're alive. There's vitality there. There's no death. You're screaming and yearning for salvation, and it's the description of unbearable pain, but that makes you realize that you're human and you're alive. And it could also be tied to the fact that he highly disliked hierarchical structures, and he did not believe in spiritual authority, especially of the Pope. I can't help but think here whether that had anything to do with his queerness as well. Obviously, we're talking about a period where homosexuality was considered a crime in the UK and much of the rest of the world. And so using something that means so much to people, like the figure of the Pope, to just kind of upsets it and just kind of making sure that it's terror. Another thing that really influenced Bacon's works was Muybridge's photography, especially the photography, I'm going to put it up here, the photography of a little boy walking on his hands and feet. And we can see that in a couple of paintings throughout Bacon's work as well. He was really obsessed with the idea of bodies and with the idea of movement. And one thing that we're able to put into words while I was looking at his paintings up until a few days ago when I started researching things for this video was that a lot of his paintings of people appear to be almost smudged. They give the impression of a fleeting moment and somebody that cannot sit still. And this is exactly what it is. Bacon was so obsessed with movement that his characters, his people, were moving on their own axis. So you can see his faces sort of moving, but they're not actually moving the rest of their body. He is just depicting them as they move. So he would have one of his friends or his partners sit for a portrait, because he was famous for his portraits, even though they were a bit twisted, you know. And he would just ask them to behave normally, sit down, but feel free to move, you know, very differently than other portraits. So you see these faces that sort of move, and it seems like they're caught in the middle of movement. And this just gives such a different feeling to the painting, in my own opinion. You can see that there's life, and they're not just there. They're not portrayed as classical portraits. They're not just stuffy and sat. There's more vitality and dynamic there. And so I thought that was very interesting to finally get a critic's perspective on this. But getting to the more queer part, so Schmied actually does dedicate a part of his book to Bacon's homosexuality, actually wondering whether we should talk more about his sexuality when we talk about his art, and whether that actually kind of boxes him up into particular type of artist, like a queer artist that was fighting for queer liberation and all of that, which he wasn't doing. He was a proud homosexual, but he wasn't out in parades or anything like that. Or yet we look at his art in the grand scheme of things, and that's what he settles on. I don't think personally that you could ever separate Bacon or any artist from their sexuality or their background, all of that. I'm sure that if we were to dig further, we would see his relationship with his father, his siblings, which actually we don't know much about yet. There's a lot that contributed to his work. It's not just one specific violent event that was on the news. There's a lot of different events that made Bacon aware of his own mortality, aware of his own body, aware of a lot of things. But one thing that I want to remark on is the fact that Bacon was not aware somehow, or was not trying to depict or insert his sexuality into his paintings, because that was absolutely not true. Bacon had a very unfortunate love life, let's say. He had two main partners in his life, and both of them died on very important days for Bacon. So his first partner died on the day of Bacon's first big retrospective, and then 10 years later his life partner George Dyer, who was also a model for a lot of Francis Bacon's paintings, committed suicide using pills and alcohol in Paris on the night of Bacon's first Paris retrospective. And one of the things that always struck me about Bacon, and why I consider him one of my favorite painters, is probably Triptych 1972, which was done after George Dyer passed away. And at the Tate Gallery in London, there's a little postcard that is sold in the shop, and it has the description, let's say, of this triptych. Bacon was a fan of triptychs. He loved the movement that he could portray from one painting to the other. A triptych, in case you don't know, it's three paintings hung side by side. And he was a big fan of those. He made a lot of those throughout his life. And I just want to read to you what he wrote in this little description, because I think it encapsulates a lot of what Bacon is about and a lot of why I really like him. I'm going to put up here the triptych that I'm referring to, which is at the Tate Britain in London. And this, what I'm about to recite to you, is the poem that Francis Bacon wrote to accompany this triptych. It says, "You're a gay man. Sex is still a punishable offense. Love perhaps feels the same way. You describe obsessive love as something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. The day before your first Tate retrospective, your partner is found dead, probably from alcohol. History mockingly repeats itself. Nearly a decade later, just before your retrospective at the Grand Palais in Paris, your next partner is found dead from an overdose in your hotel room. You're Francis Bacon. Triptych August 1972 is the painting that follows this torture. You don't paint studies of flowers in a vase, and you aren't going to start now." I think if we take a moment to actually look at the words that this man wrote, we saw first of all that for him, love was almost out of reach. It was a period where there were a lot of raids on homosexuals in the cities and in the countrysides everywhere in the UK. And it just did not feel safe. But at the same time, we look at how he says, "You describe obsessive love as something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy." So he did feel love. He did feel the obsession with the people that he encountered, and those then poured into his own art, which is why I think the gist of his art has a lot to do with homosexuality. At the time, it was just violence. Like the threat of violence or the violence of these sexual encounters, anything that would get you associated with homosexuality meant violence for you, for your loved ones maybe. It really, depended on who you would find. But I cannot help but think that maybe if he wasn't gay, then he wouldn't have felt how much violence was part of his life and how much this difference made him a target and made him behave and think differently. And he did have self-destructive tendencies, and could he be related to that? Probably, but we will never know for sure. And as I said before, there's a lot that critics don't connect, because we still have the idea that sometimes we need to divide or split the idea from the artist to their art, but I don't think it's possible. Like, every artist paints and builds things from their own heart, from their own experience. How can you split the two? I don't think it's possible, personally. But yeah, this is the type of man that Bacon was. He was not perfect by any means. He was stubborn, he was obsessive, he had plenty of flaws, but he was also deeply in love with art and with his own art, with depicting the way we live inside our own bodies. And he was adamant in reminding us that we are all mortals, that we're all just made of flesh, and that can end just like this. And that's because of violence, that's because of the banality of evil in other people. He just couldn't really explain it, but he found it inevitable. And so you have it. I will leave my sources down in the description box, and I hope you can look up some of his works or borrow some books from the library, because I think he's a really interesting artist to discuss and think about. And who knows, I don't know where you're watching this from, but there's plenty of his works all around the world. There's ones in Germany, there's a lot in the UK and in New York or in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of his paintings are in different places, and I hope you can enjoy at least one of them in person, or maybe you remember that you actually have seen his paintings somewhere. But now you know what they mean, and you know why he painted the way he painted. And so this is where I leave you. I hope you enjoyed this little art history lesson, let's say. I'm not an art historian, I'm just very passionate about certain artists, and I hope I can make you a little bit more knowledgeable as well. Bye!